About it, I'm going to invite Dr. Sameer Saran and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi on the stage.
So good morning, friends. It's time now as we are closing the academic forum. RIS and ORF have decided to have this network launched here. We had some discussions in Bali and we wanted to take that forward with the LPM FEB University. And our idea was in terms of taking a partnership with all the leading think tanks, research institutions, particularly as we talk about the Southern Presidency of G20 led by Indonesia, India, and now we go to Brazil and South Africa. Countries which do not have adequate research backup like the OECD members of the G20 have. And this is why we thought that research institutions, as External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar said yesterday, the research has to be the pivot in terms of why policymakers would get attracted to T20. And that's the magnet we have to have with us. And for that, researchers have to come together. They have to collate their energies. They have to collate databases, the way they adopt research methodologies, the way they adopt interdisciplinary approaches that are needed by the platforms like G20 across the task forces, across the various mandates that are there, both on Sherpa track as well as on finance track. And this idea we have been mulling over for some time. Thanks to Sameer's leadership, we have now converged and we have thought of pulling in some resources from RIS, pulling in some resources from ORF, putting it together, commissioning papers that are going to be useful for Brazilian presidency to begin with. And Brazilian presidency that is identifying its priorities, identifying key focus areas. Our research network, as has just been mentioned, the G20 Global Research Forum, this is going to support research papers that would be of policy relevance to think tanks. Before I give the mandate and the details, let me request Sameer for his remarks.
So, just to simplify it in English, we have put together a war chest. We have put together a war chest that is going to be deployed for commissioning papers, encouraging scholarship, reaching out to academics in parts of the world that are underrepresented and not necessarily part of who we already have in this room and outside. So commissioning papers, giving them honorariums that encourage them to pursue scholarship is going to be a role in ORF, RIS. And by the way, this is not exclusive club. We welcome all others. Of course, Ambassador Chenoy will speak to us later in the evening, but certainly his leadership would be crucial in putting together an Indian cohort, but we also welcome outside participation. So those who do want to join in can contribute to this. That's one part of the process. The second part is once they have written the paper, are we giving them a platform and an amplifier to disseminate their scholarship? And as you know, a part of this Global Research Forum was launched at, and I think Ambassador Chenoy mentioned it in a previous meeting, that it was launched at the Raisina Dialogue. We created a town hall where we would meet every year, and that town hall where we brought 86 non-G20 countries to India to discuss the G20. That tradition is going to be continued. Additionally, I'm happy to report that after my discussions with our Brazilian colleagues yesterday, and with, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and colleagues in South Africa, we are going to be launching the first G20 and Global South Dialogue in Cape Town in the month of November. So we will have a Raisina town hall that will continue, and we will have this new Cape Town conversations, as it is termed, every year, where the emphasis would be to bring in these scholars and thinkers from non-G20 countries to discuss and agitate and intervene in the discussions that the 20 countries or the 20 odd countries have amongst them. So it's both a research initiative and a research dissemination initiative. It is non-exclusive. Everyone is welcome. We require resources to reach much larger constituencies. The amount that we both had and could dispose, we have put it on the table, and we would encourage others to contribute to this process so that we could reach a much larger constituency of those who can actually shape a better world tomorrow.
Thank you, Sameer. So we have thought of 4 areas of priority for this G20 Global Research Network. The first is to collaborate with governments and chairs of G20 for academic and research contributions to G20 ministerial meetings and official events, to undertake short-term studies, that is joint studies on different sectors and areas of G20 priorities, to address the commitments of the G20 developing countries from the perspective inclusive and sustainable development. And fourth and the last is to organize brainstorming sessions, webinars, some of the examples that Samir has already given, and conferences across our countries to bring in the G20 priorities right up front. We already have secured some of the support, like for instance, IRIA has come forward, they are contributing in, and like that other funding agencies, research partners, research institutions. And as Samir said, and I would like to re-emphasize this point, we are extremely committed in terms of bringing in the Global South perspective, bring in the perspectives which encourage convergence and explore the global solutions for global challenges. And from that perspective, resources, partnerships, and open networks are something that we are all completely committed for. I would very much like to call upon all our think tank partners, research institutions here in the T20 presidency led by Ambassador Chinoy. As he mentioned yesterday, we are trying to create this network in terms of how researchers can contribute and bring forward perspectives which are based on empirical evidences, which are based on the data sets that are to be developed. And I think South would have to go forward with that. So far, some of us have been meeting in platforms where different other countries have funded those platforms. But now I think as South is coming forward, the academic community would have to take the responsibility and proactive measures to create that ecosystem that External Affairs Minister yesterday talked about. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Sachin. And I just want to reiterate what Sachin has said and what Ambassador Chinoy has repeatedly said over the last 2 days in different groups, smaller groups, that these are ideas that at that moment are driven by persons and individuals, but they need to be set in a structure and institutionalized and captured so that they'll outlast some of those protagonists who are standing here or sitting in the room. And in that sense, over the next 4 months, as we conclude our presidency, we will be reaching out to you with written communication and putting in place systems that can make this a very efficient and optimum effort that is inclusive and more importantly that leaves behind or creates a legacy of partnership with countries not included. So thank you very much, and thank you Sachin, and thank you Ambassador Chinoy. I'll turn it back to Sunena now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. I can say that it is really exciting to see an idea which took seed at the start of the T20 take concrete shape in this much time, as you have just outlined. So something to look forward to. We will now be moving on to our next task force focus session, and this one is on Task Force 6, the SDGs. Before we start the panel discussion, we will, of course, be releasing the task force statement. I just want to say that Task Force 6 has been the busiest, the most productive of all task forces. They have released nearly 100 policy briefs. I don't know how they've done it, but they did. So for this, I'm going to be calling out the names of task force members who are present here. And as I call your name, please join us on stage. Gopaul Krishna Tadas, Kalpana Shastri, Nagesh Kumar, Fabio Soares, Elizabeth Sidropoulos, Riatu Kiptia, Nitya Mohan Khemka, Lukovi Seke, and Pamla Gopaul. And Shambhavi Nayak, who's also here. Thank you. Can we please put a little more energy into applauding Task Force 6 and the exemplary work they've done? We will be starting the panel discussion now, Saving the SDGs, Seeking New Pathways to the 2030 Agenda. I'm going to be calling out the names of speakers. Please come up on stage. Pamla Gopaul, Senior Program Officer and Lead Coordinator, Policy Bridge Tank Program, African Union Development Agency. Jacqueline Kitulu, Chairperson of the Board, Rocket Health Kenya. Gopaul Krishna Tadas, Visiting Fellow, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, India. Nitya Mohan Khemka, Senior Fellow at PATH, India. And Chair for this session, Anna Katharina Hornich, Director, German Institute of Development and Sustainability, Germany.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to start our panel with once more thanking the organizers, thanking the Indian presidency and all actors that contributed to the organization of this event, and of course to the organization of the overall think process this year. And now we are turning to our panel. We have a situation you're all very well aware of, where we are extremely lagging behind our on all 17 development goals. We are off track. That has been once more documented in, for instance, the Sustainable Development Report just a few months ago, which means that, for instance, within the field of climate, if we look at the current policy projections, if we continue as has been currently decided, we will end in 2100 at a 2.8 warming. We are also, if you look at social inequality, poverty-related SDGs, we know that we are off track to a degree that we are running the risk, or that we are at the risk of an additional 175 million people falling into extreme poverty globally by 2030. And we have a situation where Mr. Guterres has called for an SDG stimulus and has explicitly called the G20 to decide on an SDG stimulus. He is arguing for an SDG stimulus of $500 billion a year. That is at least minimum required in order to ramp up ambition and actually assure SDG implementation in the 7 years that we are in until 2030. And at the same time, we also know that while it's about ramping up ambition now, it's also in the geopolitical context that we are in about building the discursive platforms, the structures, the communication channels, and convergences underlining the fields where we do converge in order to build basically a basis for a beyond 2030 discussion and a beyond 2030 agenda. And this is the background to our panel, and I would like to now invite our panelists to each come in with their first opening remarks on these 2 points, the 7 years we are in and the preparations for a beyond 2030 debate. And you have been introduced already, but I would hand over to Pamla. We start with Pamla and then move over to Gopaul Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all again. As you were knowing, I'm representing the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and it's a pleasure to be addressing you this morning. In terms of the Summit for the Future, I would like to think of it as an opportunity to relook at what we have been doing and rethink our approaches for this unified international community, and how we organize ourselves around global solutions and global actions. I like to think of it as hitting a reset button, and this is indeed an opportunity for us to do that and really look at how we do this. As the Continental Development Agency, implementing goals are not easy. It's often a challenge, and also includes imperfect processes in some cases. Both SDG, Agenda 2030 and 2063 goals of the African continent, we have done a convergence rate. So when I speak SDGs, I'm also speaking the 2063 goals of the continent. And these goals outline a roadmap that requires sustainable and prosperous futures. But these frameworks are often so large that there seems to be a disconnect on, connecting to everyday lives in what we want to see improved in our citizens and in our regional levels. At the African Union Development Agency, we're working in practice to implement the SDG goals by working closely with our member states to align the national development plans to the SDG goals. And to do this, we need effective institutions, we need effective strategies, institutional enhancements to do that. Studies have shown that post-COVID, Africa and the world will reach 1 billion mark in moving to extreme poverty. However, the Africa focus, the African Union's priority actually is inclusive of social and economic development, and therefore Africa is an important player in the global arena that will continue to focus on these top priorities that Agenda 2063 and the SDGs require. And combined with our combined efforts, I do believe that it is possible to accelerate from coming out of this crisis. In fact, I think before the crisis, Africa itself has made significant strides, and it did give us, however, an awakening of what needs to be done in our education sector, our health, our food systems, and across all its value chains. So I think together, this crisis, we realize that the policies and social norms need to be changed, and the future summit of the UN for 2024 is creating these bold steps that will shift our economies and include both the people and the planet to ensure that we have social protection for all and social health. So as the African Union, what do we need to do? Africa does find itself in a balancing act with energy provision, adapting for weather-induced disasters while accelerating the development and economic growth all at the same time. We need to focus on effective coordination of partnerships, domesticating and synchronizing the SDGs by fully imposing it on already existing frameworks that we have at the national and regional levels. The Africa SDG indicators reflect significant progress made by African countries such as Mauritius, Botswana, Ghana, Rwanda, but still many more countries need to redouble its efforts to bridge the financing as well as data gaps that we have in the continent. I just want to mention here at this point that African Union is not a supranational organization like we have the EU. It is an intergovernmental organization, and therefore we accompany dialogues to amplify Africa's voices, in the climate change world. And historically, we know that Africa are the least contributors to climate change, but are impacted the most, and we're taking measures to make sure that we address this. What we are doing as the Continent's Development Agency is working on several initiatives and programs to prepare Africa for future development in terms of ATIVIT, we have a strategy providing comprehensive skills gap. And as we move to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which provides a unique opportunity to accelerate Africa's implementation on the SDGs as well as the Agenda 2063, we're having these constructive dialogues as well. I also would very quickly like to report that we just, the EU-AU Innovation Agenda has recently been endorsed by our ministers, and it's specifically designed to support sustainable growth and jobs with the focus of cooperation efforts in health, in green transition, innovation, technology, and capabilities for science in the African continent. We have the homegrown solutions where we have worked during COVID with existing manufacturers in the continent to turn, for example, school uniform manufacturers to now produce PPEs and diversify the manufacturing industry. We have the policy bridge tank that we work with think tanks and bridge that knowledge gap for knowledge between knowledge users and knowledge producers. And we also are developing 1 billion SMMEs within the continent to increase jobs and green industrialization as we are providers of natural resources and huge exporters on this in the continent. As a proactive approach, we are working with the think tank on International Futures model, where we model an integrated approach for rethinking statistically and strategically about education, demographics, health, etc. And yesterday, I just want to allude when Minister Jaishankar's comment about Africa being a continent of promise, we have taken effective steps to deliver in terms of public goods and manage this global platform that we find ourselves in. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamla, for this perspective on what does the African Union and particularly also NEPAD do in order to ramp up ambition, and ramp up ambition not only for the Agenda 2030 but in line with the Agenda 2063. Now we move over to Gopaul Krishna, and Gopaul Krishna was one of the chairs of the task force and can also report out of these discussions. And with the hope for a second round, I would ask you to be a little bit briefer, if possible. Thanks.
I take note of your observation. First of all, let me thank T20, G20 for giving us an opportunity to be part of Task Force 6 as members discussing about how to accelerate sustainable development goals. We had, in fact, a very good, interactive, intense debate, discussion over the last 8 months, touching upon almost all aspects of SDGs, whether it is what are the obstacles, what is the progress, why we are not able to achieve, and what needs to be done so that we can accelerate the pace of achieving SDGs. I think there has been an immense contribution of all the members of Task Force 6. I must acknowledge and recognize their contribution, and thank you all the members of Task Force 6. And I also thank Sunaina for acknowledging the efforts put in by Task Force 6. As she said, one of the highest number of policy briefs that we received, and we have discussed again as to how to screen them, because nobody should feel they are left out despite the fact that the papers were good. So I suppose we have taken care of those aspects. Now coming to the main subject, I think Pamla has already touched upon some of the main issues of sustainable development goals, especially in the context of what they have been doing in the African continent and some of the African countries. Yes, indeed, there are challenges, and then how we overcome these challenges so that we are able to achieve the SDGs as per the Agenda 2030. We are already halfway through the process. We have left with about remaining 7 years to go. Now the question is whether we will be able to achieve the SDGs in the remaining period. The issue is, where we are in SDGs as of now. As of now, there seems to be some progress in regard to, for instance, reduction in poverty, reduction in nutrition, reduction in child and infant mortality rates. And, otherwise, leaving aside these, I think in almost all the SDGs, we are lagging behind. The progress is slow. In fact, there has been a backslide after especially the COVID pandemic effect and also the geopolitical conflict, which has affected the food value chains, the food, fuel, and fertilizer prices, affecting the large section of the population in most of the developing countries who were dependent on these sectors. Now, the fact that there has been some backslide, now we are lost in the process about 3 years crucial period from 2020 to nearly 2023 beginning. Now how we arrest this backslide, and then whatever slow progress we could achieve before 2019, how we could accelerate that process, and whether the global community has wherewithal to accelerate the pace and achieve. In fact, when we were discussing, the point was made that there are views that it may not be possible to achieve in the coming 7 years. We thought that we should not take a pessimistic approach. Global community has resources, has capacity to pull together the skills, the capacity, and the resources so that we'll be able to achieve the SDGs. Now, I think, in this context, I would like to touch upon two main aspects. One, of course, the finance, which is required to achieve these SDGs, and a lot of that has been discussed in the last 2 days since yesterday. So many suggestions have been made about how we can augment the resource base of the multilateral development institutions, how we can capitalize MDBs so that they are able to increase their lending capacity, and whether it is possible to capitalize them given the fact that member countries may or may not agree. But then there are issues of both, one, the capitalization, second, what we have been talking about since yesterday, that there are some low-hanging fruits, whether we can capitalize on that, whether we can use the available capital efficiently so that we are able to enhance the lending capacity of these institutions. It is not only the multilateral development banks, it is also the regional development banks and the national development banks. So a lot of suggestions have been made about reforming the financial international financial architecture, but I think the issue is that reforming international financial architecture, yes, is imperative. Fundamental reforms may take time. So in the process, in the meanwhile, let us take benefit of the low-hanging fruits. Let us start from there. And then, we should, when we reform the multilateral financial institutions, we should take into account the expectations of the developing countries. Any reform should take into account the needs of the developing countries so that the post-reforms, they will be able to address the requirements of the developing countries. The second aspect, only one, on the non-financial. A lot of talks have been there on the financial aspect. On the non-financial, yes, the requirements are huge. But then, we are also able to meet some of these requirements, financial, through non-financial, system transformative approach, where we can increase the transparency, the governance, the efficiency of the system, which can deliver these SDGs in a better way so that the resource requirements to that extent can be reduced. I think I stop here given the time limitation.
Thank you. So clear plea for, on the one side, reforming the system, the financial system, governance systems, etc., but at the same time going for the low-hanging fruits within the still existing systems and as part of the reform processes. And we will now move to two sectors now in which we can think about exactly these low-hanging fruits, what are exact examples, and we will first move with Jacqueline to the sector of health and then to climate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and a real pleasure to be in this forum. And indeed in the sector of health, as I focus on that in SDG 3, We know, of course, that the COVID pandemic had a massive effect on achievement of the SDG 3. Health systems worldwide were disrupted, funds were diverted, and even just major impacts on other health priorities such as maternal and child health, infectious disease, and I mean, all those areas were literally affected. So in terms of achievement of that area, then we have really gone way back. But what are some areas? I mean, there are several areas. I won't refer to the financing, which has been very ably described by those more, in that area than I am. But I'll give some examples focusing on Kenya, and I think these are areas in which we can be replicated elsewhere in terms of, in these next 7 years, and even as we go forward, in terms of what can we do to achieve, to try and achieve that SDG 3. And one is one of the main issues about localizing and domesticating that SDG. What does it mean? What are the priorities for your country? Rather than, a one case fits all, but really localizing it to the country context. And in Kenya, yes, the SDG 3 has been aligned to the national development policies and even aligning with our medium-term plan 2 agenda. But even going further from that, in the last presidency, there was the Big 4 agenda that was launched by the then president. And that focused on 4 of the SDGs. And one of them being offering affordable healthcare or achieving universal health coverage. And in that way, then there was a focus on achieving that SDG in terms of funding, in terms of making it a priority. So I think that's one area. I mean, and along the other 4 agendas was affordable housing, there was enhancing manufacturing and food security. And again, all these are actually social determinants also, which will be part of achieving that health agenda. So again, looking at the synergies that are achieved. But number 2 really is also looking at the multi-stakeholder approach in terms of trying to achieve this agenda, that we need collaboration of all key stakeholders. And sometimes when we talk about collaboration, we sort of use it loosely and there is no structure to it. But I think establishing structures to ensure that collaboration does work. In Kenya, we have the multi-stakeholder engagement framework of 2020 to enhance harmony and synergies between different stakeholders in achieving the SDG. There's also the Interagency Technical Working Committee. There's the Kenya Stakeholder Forum that brings together COSOs working, again, to achieve the SDGs. There's bringing together, a robust and strong and inclusive private sector to be part of those stakeholders. So all these working together, of course, with national and county governments and academia and health professionals and development partners, but all coming together. And what will this then achieve then, of course, is that there's complementarity of services that are offered, but we can also leverage on technical expertise from the different areas. And the big one, achieve financing. Again, we're talking about looking for financing, and the private sector is one major source, but that can only leverage on it when there's a structured way in which to engage with it. And then my favorite, and indeed I chair the board of a digital health company, is of course embracing digital health technology. And from many perspectives. One is really even managing efforts on data. In Kenya, for example, I would say that even the information we have on the SDGs, we have public facilities reporting into a national DHIS, yet private sector, which offers half the services, does not have to report into that system. Therefore, then even the information we are using, is it really representative of what we are achieving. So again, putting that together. But in the digital health technology itself, I think that's where the greatest game changer is going to be in terms of embracing that. I know health professionals for a long time were, reluctant about digital health technologies, but I think it's what is really going to enable us to transform, to achieve in these few years and even moving beyond 2030. Because in terms of that, we are looking at improving access to healthcare, improving efficiencies in healthcare, through data analysis, AI solutions, which will help streamline processes, and moving even to the patients themselves, empowering patients to take advantage of health monitoring tools, early detection and prevention of pandemics, disease surveillance, capacity building and training for the health professionals, and health education and awareness for the public. I think in terms of embracing the digital health technology, I think that will be one of the biggest game changers in trying to achieve the SDG 3.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And you see substantial potential in the digital technologies, digitalization within the sector of health. But you also outlined some of the challenges with turning sustainability into a business model. And we will, I think, hear a little more on that topic by Nitya.
Thank you, Anna. And before we go to, the post-2030, looking forward from that agenda, I wanted to address a little bit about the implementation. The SDGs, it's very crucial to remember that the SDGs are an enabling framework for action. They're not a static framework. The framework tackles several 21st century issues that have not been tackled before: intimate partner violence, cyber crime, AMR. And this requires a fundamental shift in the way data is generated, collected, as well as partnerships for change. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself. I think my panel has done a very eloquent job, and the Task Force 6 has done a very great job in actually documenting the progress, or shall I say the lack of progress with respect to the SDGs. And of course, COVID has been a real spanner in the works. It's thrown us completely off track. And in some goals, the direction of travel is in the opposite direction of where we should be. But I think that one of the main reasons, for this disappointing performance across SDGs over the last 8 years has been the deep and intersectional inequalities that plague our society. And by intersectionalities, I mean gender, caste, class, all have inhibited opportunities for employment, for income, for access to education, access to health, access to energy, political voice. And all of this suggests, I think, that the reduction of inequalities is not a standalone goal, but it has to intersect and cross-cut all goals. And I want to talk about some of the strategies. So at the national level, I think one of the critical strategies for reducing inequalities is that of ensuring universal provision and access to quality goods and services. And this is extremely critical because all over the world we are seeing, sadly, countries moving away from this universalism to a more private insurance-based delivery of education and health. And this is very worrying, particularly in the context of recent moves towards fiscal austerity. Secondly, I wanted to say that within such policies, it's very important to ensure that the provision leads or really reaches the last mile, serving the undeserved. And Foreign Minister Jaishankar made a very eloquent case, and I think India can be a great example in this regard, particularly in the last transformational decade, where we've really seen the serving of the undeserved, leaving no one behind, getting the social services to the last mile, which can be very key. And this means that in addition to the policy of universalism, specific interventions such as affirmative action, targeted public investments to undeserved area, as well as a conscious understanding, and this I really want to make the point about localization, about understanding how policies can be implemented on the ground with reference to local realities. And then I just wanted to end by saying, where do we get the resources for such policies? And this is where the previous panel also discussed this, that macroeconomic strategies, macroeconomic policies are critical, and fiscal policies are key, particularly tax policies, I think, that seek to improve the collection from sectors and agents that have benefited disproportionately from aggregate income growth. And finally, I just wanted to say, Anna, that COVID-19 has also shown us that the global governance architecture is critical. It matters. And more committed national strategies for achieving the SDGs would require really an international context that supports such measures implemented by governments, including equitable access to global public goods, a just tax system, as well as fair rules of trade. And I think this is extremely critical if we want to achieve, or if we have any chance in the remaining 7 years to achieve the 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. We have now heard a range of challenges, but also approaches to SDG implementation, ramping up ambition. Pamla gave us already an outlook. No? We've got the SDG summit coming up in September in New York. We've got the summit of the future process unfolding slowly, finding its way, one could say, in order to set or press the reset button, you said, no? and give us the space to again ramp up ambition. At the same time, it's extremely frustrating. No? I mean, I think we should not sugarcoat the whole situation. We are completely off track, and off track actually in all world regions, in all type of countries, in terms of income levels, in terms of human development index, etc. We are not doing our job sufficiently. And if I look at, for instance, the spillover effects by the European economies, then we know that many of the high-income economies are definitely not doing their job properly. The discussions around accelerated SDG implementation make very clear this is a political agenda that requires political will. It's not a technical implementation agenda only, but mainly it's a political agenda that requires political will and requires, of course, the financing for it, both elements that we've discussed over the last 2 days. Now, if we then dig a bit deeper, the transformative levers that are again and again referred to as governance, finances, and there's a third. There's the lever of knowledge, cooperation, education. Here we are in the think tank community, the trans-regional think tank community, where knowledge cooperation is key. That's our business, that's our currency, one could say. So I would like to use the remaining time to ask the panel to reflect on how do we, out of a knowledge cooperation perspective and out of the think tank community perspective, build a platform that allows for trans-regional communication and offers already, or sort of paves the way slowly for a beyond 2030 agenda. What do we need to do in the next years without trying to be too early? Because actually the focus needs to be on using the 7 years for implementation, but we should also not forget investing into a joint space. So who would like to come in? And I'm also, this is now beyond probably our time capacity, but I would invite those who would like to come from the audience with a question, please put up your hand, and I see 2. We collect them, and then we open the floor. Yeah, please. Yeah, please go, and then we've got 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
My name is Neil. I'm Center for Diplomacy, my academic education. I had a question for I wanted to know how, what are the actions which will be important or essential to reduce the fragility and conflict in African regions so that the achievement and the sustenance of SDGs are enabled. So that would be my question.
Thanks. And we take 2 more, you and you, the others, if you have chances. And brief questions. Yeah, thanks.
Based on the experience of collaboration that you have had in India, what according to you can really be some factors for real collaboration and sort of evolve between this conversation about, as somebody said, egos and logos. What is the recipe for effective collaboration for achieving these SDGs based on your experience?
Thanks. And a third.
My question is to Jacqueline. Within the purview of G20, what policy and regulatory measures are necessary to to promote the responsible and equitable adoption of digital health solutions, ensuring that vulnerable populations are not left behind and that the benefits are distributed inclusively to advance progress towards the 2030 agenda.
Thank you. And we take 3 minutes for picking and choosing who would like to come in. I saw already Nitya and I think Jacqueline. Maybe we will make another round of questions. You, Nitya?
Anish, I want to talk a little bit about the post-2030, so perhaps Jacqueline wants to come in first to the questions.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question on a recipe for collaboration, effective collaboration. And an example I'll give within Kenya is, we are talking about leveraging the private sector. And in Kenya, in the health sector, we have the Kenya Healthcare Federation. I'm happy to say that I was one of the co-founders of that organization about 2004, because we always wanted, when government wanted to interact with private sector, it would call anyone in private sector. And that's where you begin to have problems. How representative are you of the private sector? So what KHF did then was to get all the actors in the private sector who represent the health sector. So you have the professionals, you have the institutions, you have the insurance agencies, you have the faith-based organizations, anyone, non-state private sector really coming together. And then having a forum in which you have elected members, you have committees that represent were really set on around the building blocks of the health system. So basically, when it comes to implementation of the SDGs, then when you're calling on private sector, you have a representative body that already, is dealing with matters health and can speak to confidently with health with total representation. The challenge is always, that lack of representation. So that's one of them. The other is also the Kenya SDG Forum, which has brought together over 350 CSOs, again, focusing on health and working together to implement, to monitor the changes and implementation of the SDGs. So again, I think collaboration comes with making sure there's adequate representation, then people feel they're heard. The other question was around digital technology and ensuring that it gets to everybody. I think that's what you meant, and some people are not left out. And one of the things that we have done, I think, around and can be done around digital technology is ensuring that it is accessible on all platforms. And at the lowest level, I'll say USSD, when we're looking at, let's say, using the mobile telephone. Yes, quite large populations have smartphones, but the others who have the USSDs. But you can use that for information, for knowledge sharing, for setting appointments, for follow-up for vaccinations. So again, making sure that when you use the technology, it meets the needs of the people in whichever area. So even the underserved populations can be served. I can talk about that for ages, but yes, I am being told I have no time.
In the break.
Thanks, Anna. I wanted to talk about 5 specific actions, particularly for the post-2030 agenda with respect to climate change. And I think that the first is that many countries have already, committed or indicated their net zero targets in the post-2030 context. And so to make sure that they continue on those trajectories, to hold them accountable, to ensure there's monitoring and evaluation with respect to those post-2030 trajectories. Secondly, there's obviously going to be a degree of overshoot. So countries are not going to make their 2030 targets. And so there will, after 2030, be a game of catch-up. Again, we need the budget to ensure there's monitoring and countries are accountable to their post-2030 net zero targets. Thirdly, the IPCC has also mentioned some degree of overshoot in these net zero targets, and this means that after 2030, we are going to have to extract vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We need to have the budget for Plan B, and we need to think about that strategically. Fourthly, adaptation will be very important, not only mitigation. So we need to build robust adaptation frameworks this decade so that we can catch up with the mitigation and we can cope between 2030 and the mid-century. And finally, I wanted to say the most important point is the loss and damage financial flows will eventually and inevitably be very, very critical. And so the reform of global financial architecture this decade is very key. There's been a great progress with the Bridgetown agenda with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and I really think that we need to put all our efforts behind this.
There was one question posed to me, if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
Pamla,
All right, thank you. So on the peace and security issue, climate change adaptation measures to the rest of the world takes on different connotations in terms of industrialization. In terms of the African continent, climate change impacts peace and security as well because of the movement of people to areas where they can do sustainable agricultural practices, etc. The African Union Development Agency is working closely with member states, and we are promoting the fully integrated continent in terms of how we amplify infrastructure and how we create these good quality jobs for youth. Also, we have taken measures to create or generate more masters and PhD students. We're working with academia as well because we also believe that a knowledgeable continent is a peaceful one. So the more we foster research that is geared to informing policy in this area, I think this is how we work towards addressing integrated continent. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would, if it's okay with you, Gopaul Krishna, I would now say, with the view on time, there were more hands up. We will not have the time now to discuss them. I'm sorry. I would encourage all of you, please, your hands have been seen. Please come and talk to the panelists in the break, because otherwise we are completely going beyond. And I would like to give each panelist a 40-second opportunity to say something on what is the area where you personally say, in my capacities, professional capacities, I want to push forward in this or that field. This is where I put my, not money, but energy, maybe even money. And with this, we come to an end, and we start, of course, with Gopaul Krishna.
Thank you, Anna. I was talking about initiatives that are required in the non-financial areas, because on finance, so much has been talked about, and we already have a lot of information, knowledge, and then what needs there is only the action. But on the non-financial areas, there is need for a lot of discussion and debate as to what needs to be done so that there is increase in efficiency and we create an enabling environment where we are able to attract the private sector. Because when we talk of finance, we basically look at either the government or the multilateral institutions, but the private sector, they are willing to come only if we improve the systems, we improve the governance. So can we look at these things? I think these are the areas where, as individuals, we can do further research on how we enable conducive environment so that we are able to attract the private capital into these SDGs, because SDG investment is a long-term requirement. Private sector will not enter into these long-term investments unless they are assured of returns. And the returns in the long run are uncertain. We need to ensure that the risk mitigation measures are in place and that there is a macroeconomic stability as also policy stability in the long run.
And this is also where you put all your energy. That's your point, yeah. Jacqueline, would you like to comment?
That 500 billion USD stimulus you talked about, invest it in digital health technologies. I think we shall go a long way in achieving affordable, accessible healthcare.
There's a big paradigm shift in data generation as well as use, big data, artificial intelligence, and I'd like to really spend my time in understanding and employing or developing a taxonomy with public health using artificial intelligence to collect data.
Thanks. And
Pamla, last word. Thank you. I'm leveraging from the economic analysis and foresight perspective. I lead on a program called the Policy Bridge Tank, and as I mentioned, it's to bridge this knowledge gap with African knowledge producers versus knowledge users. I'm happy to announce that we are working with African think tanks to accompany the policy platform so that we can inform economic reforms as we go along on an evidence-based approach. And basically, the foresight work that we are doing, we will be training think tanks and officials from our member states on foresight analysis so that we can leverage on our prosperous Africa. I just want to leave by saying that it has been 10 years, a decade now, when The Economist, as you know, proclaimed the African continent as a hopeless continent. I'm happy to report that it has only taken 10 years for them to turn their mindset because of the progress and prosperity Africa is making in that domain. Thanks.
And with this, I thank the panelists. And let me just say, we've experienced, or we are experiencing a G20 presidency